The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Prince Louis walked with measured steps. At 25 years old, he had learned to carry himself with the dignity expected of third in line to the throne, though his heart often felt heavy with the weight of expectations that seemed impossible to meet. Louis paused before the portrait gallery, his eyes lingering on the painted faces of his ancestors. Kings and queens who had shaped nations, led armies, and made decisions that echoed through history. His great-grandmother's portrait gazed down at him with kind but knowing eyes, as if she understood the burden he carried. She had been the people's princess, beloved by millions, yet even she had struggled with the demands of royal life. "Your Royal Highness," came a soft voice behind him. Sarah, his private secretary, approached with a tablet in her hands. "The schedule for today's engagements." Louis nodded, accepting the device. 3 charity visits, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and dinner with foreign dignitaries. Each event carefully choreographed, every word he would speak pre-approved by the communications team. He had become expert at smiling on command, at finding the right balance between approachable warmth and royal reserve. Yet lately, the mask felt heavier than ever. "There's also this," Sarah added hesitantly, handing him a newspaper. The headline made his stomach clench: "Prince Louis, the Forgotten Royal?" The article questioned his relevance in the modern monarchy, comparing him unfavorably to his more charismatic siblings. It wasn't the first such piece, and it wouldn't be the last. Louis folded the paper without reading further. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be ready in 20 minutes. As she departed, Louis remained in the gallery, surrounded by centuries of royal history. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother William. "Saw the paper. Don't let them get to you. You're doing important work." Well-meaning words from someone who would one day wear the crown, someone who had never questioned his place in the grand scheme of things. The irony wasn't lost on Louis. Here he was, born into unimaginable privilege, living in palaces, with access to the finest education and opportunities money couldn't buy. Yet he felt more isolated than he had ever imagined possible. The golden cage was still a cage, and the bars were made of protocol, duty, and public expectation. He thought of Marcus, his university roommate who had become a teacher in Manchester. Marcus worked 16-hour days, often spending his own money on supplies for underprivileged children, but his eyes lit up when he talked about helping a struggling student finally understand a difficult concept. There was purpose there, real impact, the kind that couldn't be measured in newspaper inches or approval ratings. The first engagement of the day was at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, where Louis was scheduled to open a new cancer ward. As his car pulled through the gates, he saw the small crowd of photographers and reporters waiting. Their cameras would capture every angle, every expression, ready to analyze whether his smile seemed genuine or forced. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the hospital's chief pediatric oncologist, greeted him at the entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes but gentle hands, someone who had dedicated her life to fighting childhood cancer. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for coming. The staff and families are so excited to meet you." As they walked through the corridors, Louis was struck by the contrast between this place and the palace he had left that morning. Here, every room told a story of struggle and hope. Colorful drawings created by young patients decorated the walls. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency, their faces showing the strain of carrying emotional burdens that would crush most people. In the new ward, Louis met 8-year-old Emma, who was receiving treatment for leukemia. She wore a bright pink headscarf and clutched a worn teddy bear, her eyes bright despite the illness that ravaged her small body. "Are you really a prince?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. "I am," Louis replied, kneeling to her eye level. "But I think you might be braver than any prince I know." Emma giggled. "Princes don't get scared, do they?" Louis paused, feeling the weight of honesty. According to protocol, he should maintain the fairy tale image, reassure her that princes were always brave and strong. Instead, he found himself saying, "Actually, I get scared quite often. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are afraid." The little girl nodded seriously, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "My mummy says the same thing. She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping, but she's still the bravest person I know." Later, as Louis cut the ribbon to officially open the ward, he spoke briefly to the gathered crowd. The words came from somewhere deeper than his usual prepared remarks. "This ward represents more than medical advancement," he said.
It represents our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable among us.
Every child who receives treatment here is a reminder that true nobility lies not in titles or birthright, but in how we care for one another. The reporters scribbled notes, but Lewis wasn't thinking about tomorrow's headlines.
He was thinking about Emma's question and his unexpected answer. When had he last spoken so honestly about fear? When had he last acknowledged his own vulnerability?
The second engagement was a community centre in East London, where Lewis was scheduled to meet with youth mentorship programs. The building stood in stark contrast to the gleaming hospital, its brick facade weathered by decades of service to one of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. James Mitchell, the center's director, was a man in his 40s who had grown up in these same streets. His handshake was firm, his manner direct but respectful. "We're honored by your visit, Your Highness. These kids don't get many chances to meet someone like you." As they toured the facilities, Lewis observed teenagers engaged in various activities. In one room, a coding class was underway, with young people from diverse backgrounds working together to create simple programs. In another, a group practiced interview skills, helping each other prepare for job applications. Most of these kids come from single-parent households, James explained. Many have never seen a successful adult who looks like them or comes from where they come from. They need to know that their circumstances don't define their potential. In the main hall, Lewis addressed a group of about 50 young people, aged 14 to 18. He had given similar speeches dozens of times, usually focusing on the importance of education and hard work. But, looking at their faces, he saw something that reminded him of his own reflection in recent months, a mixture of hope and skepticism, dreams tempered by harsh realities. "I'm supposed to tell you that anything is possible if you work hard enough," Lewis began, deviating from his prepared remarks. "And, while hard work is important, I'd be lying if I didn't acknowledge that some of you face challenges I've never had to confront. You're asked to climb mountains while carrying weights that others never have to bear."
The room grew quiet.
These weren't the usual platitudes they expected from visiting dignitaries. "But, I've met extraordinary people in my work," Lewis continued. "People who started with less than you have now and created lives of meaning and impact.
Not all of them became wealthy or famous.
Many became teachers, nurses, social workers, mechanics, parents who raised good children. They found ways to matter, to make a difference in their corner of the world." A young woman raised her hand.
"But, it's easy to say that when you're a prince, isn't it?
You've never had to worry about money or where you'll live tomorrow." The question hung in the air, challenging and honest. Lewis felt the familiar urge to deflect, to maintain the appropriate distance between royalty and subjects. Instead, he found himself nodding.
"You're absolutely right," he said. "I've never worried about money or housing or whether I could afford university. I was born with advantages that gave me opportunities you have to fight for. I can't pretend otherwise."
"So why should we listen to you?" another voice called out, not hostile but genuinely curious. Lewis was quiet for a moment, considering.
"Maybe you shouldn't," he said finally.
"Maybe you should listen to people like Mr. Mitchell, who grew up in these streets and chose to come back and help others. Maybe you should listen to your teachers who see your potential every day.
Maybe you should listen to each other."
"Then, why are you here?" the first young woman asked. "Because I'm still learning what it means to use whatever privilege I have in ways that actually matter," Lewis replied.
"And, because talking to you helps me understand what real courage looks like." The conversation continued for another hour, more honest and challenging than any royal engagement Lewis could remember. No one asked for selfies or autographs.
Instead, they shared stories about their ambitions, their fears, their frustrations with a system that often seemed designed to keep them in place. By the time Lewis returned to the palace that evening, his mind was churning with questions he had been avoiding for months. During dinner, he barely touched his food, prompting concern from his security detail and staff. That night, he found himself in his private study, staring at the ornate ceiling and thinking about Emma's simple question about fear and the challenging voices of the teenagers in East London. The newspaper article lay open on his desk, its criticism now seeming less important than the larger questions it raised about purpose and relevance.
His phone rang.
The caller ID showed his father's private number. "Lewis," the king's voice came through clearly.
"I heard about your engagements today. Apparently, you went somewhat off-script."
Lewis tensed, expecting the familiar lecture about protocol and message control.
"Yes, sir.
I felt the situation called for more honesty than usual.
There was a pause. I also heard that the response was quite positive. Real connection rather than polite applause. The young people asked difficult questions. They deserved honest answers. Indeed. Another pause. We should talk soon about the direction of your work. There may be opportunities to explore new approaches to royal duties. After the call ended, Louis returned to the window, looking out at the city lights of London. Somewhere out there, Emma was fighting her battle with courage that humbled him. Somewhere, teenagers were dreaming of futures they would have to fight to create. And here he was, grappling with the question of how to use his unique position to do more than simply fulfill obligations. The next morning brought a new round of headlines, but these were different. Prince Louis speaks truth to youth, read one. Royal honesty refreshes tired formula, declared another. His communications team was pleased but puzzled by the positive response to what they considered a departure from best practices. But Louis wasn't thinking about headlines as he prepared for another day of engagements. He was thinking about Emma's definition of bravery and the searching questions of young people who had no patience for empty words. Something had shifted during those conversations, a recognition that his discomfort with the traditional royal role might not be a weakness but an opportunity. As he looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie for another day of public service, Louis saw something different in his reflection. The weight was still there, but it felt less like a burden and more like a responsibility he was finally ready to carry in his own way. The questions that had haunted him for months remained unanswered, but, for the first time in years, he felt ready to seek those answers honestly, regardless of where they might lead. The invitation arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered with the usual ceremony that accompanied all royal correspondence. Lord Pemberton, chairman of the Royal Foundation's board, requested Prince Louis's presence at an urgent strategy meeting regarding the foundation's future direction. The formal language couldn't mask the underlying tension that had been building for weeks. Louis arrived at the Foundation's headquarters in Covent Garden to find the conference room filled with faces he recognized but had never truly connected with. These were the architects of royal philanthropy, men and women who had spent decades crafting the careful balance between public service and political neutrality that defined modern monarchy. "Your Royal Highness," Lord Pemberton began, his tone polite but strained. "We need to discuss your recent public statements. While the press response has been largely positive, there are concerns about the precedent being set." Margaret Thornfield, the Foundation's communications director, leaned forward with a tablet full of analytics. "Your off-script moments are gaining significant social media traction, but they're also generating questions about the monarchy's traditional approach to public engagement. Some commentators are asking whether this represents a new direction for the royal family." Louis listened as the discussion continued around him, feeling increasingly like an observer in conversations about his own life. These were good people with genuine concerns about protecting an institution that had survived for centuries by carefully managing its public image. Yet their words felt disconnected from the faces he had seen in recent days: Emma's brave smile, the challenging questions from teenagers who had every right to demand authenticity from their leaders. "The concern," continued Sir David Walsh, a veteran palace advisor, "is that spontaneous commentary, however well-intentioned, can be misinterpreted or taken out of context. The monarchy's strength lies in its consistency and careful neutrality. But what if that consistency is part of the problem?" Louis found himself asking, surprising even himself with the directness of the question. The room fell silent. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. "I'm not sure I follow, Your Royal Highness." Louis stood, moving to the window that overlooked the bustling streets below. "I've spent the last week meeting people who are fighting real battles with limited resources and unlimited courage. They asked me honest questions and deserved honest answers. The response wasn't negative because I abandoned protocol. It was positive because, for once, I engaged as a human being rather than a carefully programmed spokesperson." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "But, Your Royal Highness, the role comes with certain constraints. The monarchy's influence depends on its perceived neutrality and stability." "Does it, though?" Louis turned back to face the group. "When was the last time anyone in this room spoke to someone under 30 about their perception of the royal family? When did we last ask whether our careful neutrality is perceived as relevance or indifference?" Sir David's expression hardened slightly. "The institution has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting gradually, not through sudden course corrections that risk undermining public trust." Louis felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on his shoulders, but this time it felt different.
Instead of crushing him, it seemed to clarify his thoughts.
I'm not suggesting sudden course corrections. I'm asking whether we're so focused on protecting the institution that we've forgotten what it's supposed to serve.
The conversation continued for 2 hours, growing increasingly circular as each side restated positions that seemed fundamentally incompatible. By the end, no resolution had been reached, but Lewis sensed that something had been set in motion that couldn't easily be stopped. That afternoon, he cancelled his remaining appointments and drove himself to Richmond Park, something his security detail grudgingly allowed after extensive negotiations. He needed space to think, away from the constant presence of staff and advisors who meant well but filtered every experience through the lens of public relations and risk management. Walking along the Thames path, Lewis reflected on the morning's meeting. These were people who had dedicated their careers to serving the Crown, yet their vision of service felt increasingly at odds with what he had experienced in recent days. Their concerns weren't wrong, the monarchy did need to maintain its constitutional role, and stability was important. But stability without relevance was simply elaborate irrelevance. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Catherine. "Dad wants to see you tomorrow.
Think carefully about what you want to say."
That evening, Lewis sat in his study with a stack of letters that arrived daily at the palace. Usually, his staff screened correspondence and provided summaries, but tonight he read them himself. Letter after letter from people sharing their stories, a single mother struggling to afford her child's medical treatment, a veteran dealing with homelessness, teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to turn. One letter stood out, written in careful handwriting on simple stationery. "Your Royal Highness, I saw the news about your visit to the community center.
My daughter was there that day.
She came home talking about how you said it was okay to be scared sometimes. She's been having nightmares since her father died in Afghanistan, and she thought being afraid made her weak. You helped her understand that courage and fear can exist together.
Thank you for talking to her like she mattered."
Lewis read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening his conviction that the path forward, however uncertain, lay in more such moments of genuine connection rather than fewer.
The next morning brought his requested audience with the king.
Lewis arrived at Clarence House to find his father in the garden, tending to roses that had been his passion for decades. This was King Charles at his most relaxed, dirty hands and old clothes revealing the man behind the crown. "Your mother always said that gardens teach patience," the king said without looking up from his pruning. "You plant seeds without knowing what the final result will be, but you tend them faithfully because you believe in the process." Lewis joined his father among the roses, recognizing the indirect approach that had characterized their most important conversations over the years. "I've been hearing interesting reports about your recent engagements," the king continued. "Lord Pemberton seems concerned about what he calls message discipline.
Others suggest you found something authentic that's been missing from royal communication."
"I've been thinking about what it means to serve," Lewis replied carefully.
"Whether we're serving the institution or serving through the institution."
The king smiled slightly, setting down his pruning shears. "A distinction your great-grandmother would have understood.
She struggled with the same question, you know. The tension between duty to the crown and duty to conscience."
They walked together toward a bench overlooking the garden's most secluded corner. Here, away from staff and advisors, Lewis felt he could speak more freely. "I met a little girl with leukemia last week," he began. "She asked me if princes get scared. Everything in my training told me to maintain the fairy tale, to be what she needed me to be. But I told her the truth instead, that I get scared often, but that being brave means acting despite the fear."
"And how did she respond?"
"She nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world.
Like honesty was what she needed, not fantasy."
The king was quiet for a long moment. "Your great-grandmother once told me that the crown's greatest power wasn't in its authority but in its ability to give people permission to be better than they thought possible. But that only works if they believe you understand their struggles. The system we've built makes that understanding almost impossible," Lewis said. "We're so protected from real consequence, so insulated from genuine hardship, that our compassion risks becoming theoretical." "Perhaps. But you've been given a unique platform. The question isn't whether you can eliminate the distance between your experience and others, but whether you can use that platform to elevate voices and causes that might otherwise go unheard." As they continued talking, Lewis sensed his father grappling with the same questions that had been consuming him. The monarchy had survived by adapting to changing times, but adaptation required recognizing when change was necessary. "There's going to be resistance," the king warned. The institution moves slowly for good reasons, and there are those who believe any departure from established protocols threatens everything we've built.
And what do you believe?
King Charles smiled, looking every bit his age but also somehow more vital than Louis had seen him in years. I believe that institutions that stop growing begin dying, and that authenticity is becoming more valuable than authority. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Private Secretary Sir Anthony Morrison, whose expression suggested urgent business.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, forgive the interruption. There's been a development that requires immediate attention. Back in the King's private study, Sir Anthony presented them with early editions of tomorrow's newspapers.
The headlines varied, but the theme was consistent: Prince Louis challenges royal tradition, and palace insiders question Prince's new approach. The story appears to have been sourced from yesterday's foundation meeting, Sir Anthony explained diplomatically. Several board members expressed concerns about Your Royal Highness's recent statements, and it seems those concerns have found their way to the press.
Louis felt his stomach tighten.
The leak wasn't surprising. Palace politics had always operated through strategic disclosure, but the timing suggested a coordinated effort to pressure him back into conventional behavior. "What's the recommended response?" the king asked. "The communications team suggests a statement reaffirming Your Royal Highness's commitment to traditional royal protocols while acknowledging the value of connecting with younger audiences."
Louis looked at his father, then back at Sir Anthony. "And if I'm not prepared to make that statement?"
Sir Anthony's expression didn't change, but Louis caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Then, we would need to consider how to manage the resulting narrative."
The king dismissed Sir Anthony with instructions to delay any public response until the following day.
Once they were alone again, he turned to Louis with an expression that mixed paternal concern with royal calculation. "You're at a crossroads," he said simply. "You can step back from this path, accept the guidance of those who've managed royal communication successfully for decades, and continue in the traditional model of service. Or you can continue forward, knowing that you'll face significant resistance and that the outcome is uncertain." Louis thought again of Emma's question about fear, of the teenagers who had challenged him to justify his privileged position, of the letters from people who needed more than polite sympathy. "When you chose to speak out about environmental issues decades ago, despite criticism that it was inappropriate for the heir to the throne, what convinced you to continue?" The king smiled. "The knowledge that some things are too important to leave to others, and that sometimes the only way to honor the crown is to risk it." That evening, Louis made two decisions that would change everything. First, he called Dr. Chen at St. Mary's Hospital and asked if he could return the following week, not for a formal engagement but to spend time with patients and families without cameras or press officers. Second, he drafted a personal statement that addressed the growing controversy directly.
As he wrote, Louis realized that the young people in East London had given him something more valuable than any royal protocol. They had shown him that authenticity wasn't a luxury he couldn't afford, it was a responsibility he couldn't avoid. The statement wouldn't be released until morning, but its contents were already changing the trajectory of his life and, possibly, the monarchy itself. The hall might fall quiet when he finally spoke his truth, but, for the first time in years, Louis was ready for whatever silence might follow. The statement Louis released that morning would be remembered as the moment everything changed, though its impact wouldn't be fully understood for days. Written in his own words, without the careful polish of professional communication staff, it began with a simple acknowledgement: "I have been struggling to understand my role in modern Britain, and I believe that struggle itself might be part of the answer." Within hours, the palace communications team was in crisis mode. Sir Anthony Morrison convened emergency meetings while phones rang constantly with requests for clarification, expansion, and damage control. But Louis had deliberately avoided the usual approval process, releasing the statement through his personal social media accounts before anyone could intervene. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Traditional monarchist groups expressed alarm at what they saw as dangerous precedent setting. Conservative commentators questioned whether Louis understood the constitutional implications of his words. But younger voices, particularly on social media, responded with unexpected enthusiasm. #RealRoyalty began trending, filled with messages from people who felt heard for the first time by a member of the royal family. Louis spent the day away from the palace, honoring his commitment to return to St. Mary's Hospital. This time, there were no photographers or formal schedules. Dr. Chen had arranged for him to spend unstructured time with patients and families, experiencing the reality of their daily struggles without the buffer of official protocol.
In the pediatric ward, Louis met Marcus, a 10-year-old boy whose brain tumor had required multiple surgeries. His parents, David and Sarah Patterson, had been living at the hospital for 3 months, taking turns sleeping in uncomfortable chairs while maintaining optimism for their son's recovery. "We read your statement this morning," Sarah said quietly while Marcus slept. "It meant something to hear someone in your position admit they don't have all the answers." David nodded, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Everyone keeps telling us to stay positive, to believe everything will work out. But sometimes it helps to acknowledge that life is hard and uncertain, even when you're doing everything right." Louis found himself sharing stories he had never told in public settings, his own struggles with anxiety, the isolation that came with constant scrutiny, the pressure to appear perfect when he felt anything but. These weren't calculated revelations designed to humanize his image, they were honest responses to people facing genuine hardship. "The thing is," Louis said, watching Marcus sleep peacefully despite the machines surrounding him, "I've been given this platform not because I earned it or because I'm particularly qualified, but by accident of birth. The question isn't whether I deserve it, but how I can use it to draw attention to people like you who are fighting battles most of us can't imagine." Later that afternoon, while Louis was still at the hospital, his brother William called with urgent news. "The Prime Minister's office has requested a meeting," William said. "Apparently, your statement has raised questions about royal political neutrality." Louis stepped into a quiet corridor. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that require careful handling. Father wants to see both of us tonight. This is bigger than family politics now." The drive back to London gave Louis time to process the day's experiences. Marcus's parents hadn't asked him to solve their problems or provide false reassurance. They had simply appreciated his willingness to acknowledge their reality honestly. Yet that simple act of recognition was apparently threatening enough to require intervention from the highest levels of government. That evening's meeting at Buckingham Palace included not only the King and Prince William, but also the private secretary, the Queen's representative, and senior constitutional advisors. The ornate drawing room, with its centuries of royal history embedded in every detail, seemed to emphasize the weight of tradition being challenged. "The concern," began Lord Chancellor Harrison, "is that your Royal Highness's statement could be interpreted as political commentary, particularly the references to struggling with your role and the implications about systemic issues." Louis looked around the room at faces that reflected decades of careful constitutional navigation. "I spoke about my personal journey and the people I've met. How is personal reflection political commentary? When a member of the royal family questions their role publicly, it inevitably raises questions about the institution itself," replied Sir James Worthington, the constitutional expert. "The monarchy's stability depends on public perception of its members as confident in their duties and united in their commitment." Prince William leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but concerned. "Louis, I understand what you're trying to achieve, but the timing is delicate. We're already dealing with questions about relevance and cost. Public uncertainty about our commitment to traditional roles could strengthen Republican arguments." The king had remained silent throughout the discussion, but now he spoke with quiet authority. "What exactly are you proposing we do? Force Louis to retract a statement about his personal growth and commitment to service?" "We're suggesting a clarifying statement," Lord Harrison replied carefully. "Something that contextualizes yesterday's comments within a framework of unwavering dedication to constitutional monarchy. In other words," Louis said, "an apology disguised as clarification." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. These were people accustomed to deference, to careful diplomacy that avoided direct confrontation. Louis's bluntness violated protocols that had governed royal discourse for generations. "Your Royal Highness," Sir James said finally, "the monarchy has survived for over a millennium by adapting gradually while maintaining core principles. Dramatic departures from established norms, however well-intentioned, risk undermining the very institution you're trying to serve." Louis thought of Marcus's parents, of Emma's question about fear, of the teenagers who had challenged him to justify his privilege. What if those core principles include honesty, authenticity, and genuine service? What if gradual adaptation isn't sufficient for the challenges we're facing? The discussion continued late into the evening, becoming increasingly circular as each side restated positions that seemed fundamentally incompatible. By the time the meeting concluded, no resolution had been reached, but everyone understood that a line had been crossed that couldn't easily be uncrossed. Over the following days, the controversy deepened. Traditional media outlets published editorial after editorial debating the appropriateness of Louis's approach. senior royals were reportedly divided, with some supporting his authenticity while others worried about precedent and protocol. Palace staff found themselves navigating unprecedented territory, unsure how to manage a senior royal who insisted on speaking without scripts. But something unexpected was happening outside the traditional power structures. Letters and messages poured in from people across Britain and beyond, sharing their own struggles and expressing gratitude for what they saw as unprecedented honesty from a royal family member. The volume was overwhelming, thousands of personal stories from people who felt seen and validated by Louis's willingness to admit uncertainty and vulnerability. One letter particularly moved him, from a veterans group in Wales: "Your Royal Highness, many of us have struggled with feelings of purposelessness after military service. We were trained to believe that doubt was weakness and uncertainty was failure. Your admission that you question your role and struggle to find meaning gives us permission to acknowledge our own struggles without shame." Sometimes leadership means being brave enough to show that leaders are human too. Louis began responding to some letters personally, another departure from protocol that sent palace staff into concerned consultations. But each response deepened his conviction that authenticity wasn't a luxury he couldn't afford, it was essential to meaningful service. The crisis came to a head 2 weeks later during the annual state opening of Parliament. This was ceremonial monarchy at its most formal, with the king reading the government's legislative program while the royal family displayed unity and constitutional propriety. Louis's participation was expected and traditionally non-controversial. But, as the ceremony approached, protests began gathering outside Parliament. Not the usual Republican demonstrations, but something new: people carrying signs supporting what they called real royalty and demanding more honesty from public institutions. The irony wasn't lost on Louis. His admission of uncertainty had inspired certainty in others that change was possible. On the morning of the ceremony, Louis received an unexpected visitor. Dame Margaret Hodge, a veteran parliamentarian known for her directness, had requested a private meeting. "Your Royal Highness," she began without preamble, "I've been watching this controversy with interest. I've spent decades in public service, and I've seen how fear of authenticity can drain institutions of their vitality." Louis invited her to sit in his private study, curious about her perspective. "The question isn't whether you've broken protocol," Dame Margaret continued. "It's whether the protocol you've broken was serving the people it was meant to protect. From where I sit, you've reminded us that public service requires vulnerability, not perfection. The constitutional advisors disagree. Constitutional advisors are paid to worry about precedent. But sometimes precedent needs to be challenged by someone with enough credibility to survive the initial backlash." She paused, studying Louis with the sharp assessment of someone who had navigated political waters for decades. "You have a choice to make today," she said finally. "You can participate in the ceremony as expected, allowing the controversy to fade into historical footnote. Or you can use the platform to demonstrate that constitutional monarchy can accommodate honest reflection about its role and purpose." After Dame Margaret left, Louis sat alone in his study, considering her words. The state opening was hours away, and he still wasn't certain what he would do. But he knew that whatever choice he made would define not only his own future but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. "Marcus is responding well to treatment. His parents asked me to tell you that your visit meant everything to them. Sometimes presence matters more than answers." Louis stared at the message, thinking about presence versus performance, about the difference between being seen and being understood. The ceremony would proceed regardless of his internal struggle, but his participation, how he chose to embody his role, would send a message about what kind of monarchy was possible. That afternoon, as he prepared for the state opening, Louis made a decision that surprised even him. He would attend the ceremony, fulfill his constitutional duties, and maintain the dignity expected of his position. But he would do so as himself, not as a perfectly polished representative of an institution above human struggle, but as a person committed to serving authentically, whatever the cost. The hall that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremony was about to witness something unprecedented: a prince choosing truth over tradition, even when he couldn't predict the consequences. The House of Lords chamber had never felt more imposing than it did that afternoon as Prince Louis entered for the state opening of Parliament. Centuries of constitutional tradition seemed to press down from the vaulted ceiling, while hundreds of peers, MPs, and dignitaries filled the ornate space with expectant energy. This ceremony had proceeded virtually unchanged for decades, each participant knowing their role in the carefully choreographed display of British constitutional democracy. Louis took his designated position near the throne, acutely aware that his every gesture would be analyzed for signs of his internal struggle. The recent controversy had made him the most watched member of the royal family, with newspapers speculating about whether he would maintain proper decorum or somehow continue his pattern of unsettling departures from protocol. The king entered with the traditional ceremony, carrying himself with the dignity that had defined his approach to monarchy for decades. As he prepared to read the Queen's speech outlining the government's legislative agenda, Louis found his mind drifting to the conversations that had brought him to this moment: Emma's brave smile in the hospital bed, the challenging questions from teenagers who refused to accept empty platitudes, Marcus's parents finding comfort in honest acknowledgement of life's uncertainty. The speech proceeded as expected, covering economic policy, healthcare reform, and educational initiatives. Each item was presented in the formal language that had characterized such occasions for generations, creating a sense of continuity and institutional stability that formed the backbone of British constitutional monarchy. But, as the ceremony continued, Louis became increasingly aware of a disconnect between the formal pronouncements echoing through the chamber and the real struggles he had witnessed in recent weeks. The policies being announced would affect millions of lives, yet they were presented in language that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate their human impact. When the king reached the section on youth services and mental health support, Louis felt something shift inside him. These weren't abstract policy proposals, they were responses to the exact challenges he had seen firsthand in hospital wards and community centers. The teenagers who had questioned his relevance were among those who would be most affected by these decisions. As tradition dictated, the ceremony proceeded without interruption. But, as it neared its conclusion, something unexpected happened. The king departed the chamber, followed by the royal family in order of precedence. Louis walked behind his brother William, maintaining the dignified pace expected of such occasions. But, instead of proceeding directly to the waiting cars, Louis stopped in the corridor outside the chamber. Security officers and palace staff immediately tensed, unsure how to respond to this departure from protocol. Members of the press, positioned to capture the traditional exit, suddenly found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. Prince William paused, realizing his brother was no longer behind him.
"Louis," he said quietly, concern evident in his voice.
Louis looked at his brother, then at the assembled officials and press representatives. For a moment, the weight of institutional expectation seemed almost crushing. Everything in his training told him to continue walking, to maintain the ceremonial dignity that had served the monarchy for centuries.
Instead, he did something that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd: he bowed his head.
Not the formal bow required by protocol, but a deep, personal gesture of humility that seemed to acknowledge both the weight of his position and his own limitations in fulfilling it. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, lasting perhaps 3 seconds but feeling much longer to everyone who witnessed it. The corridor fell completely silent. Even hardened political reporters, accustomed to unexpected moments, seemed stunned by the simple but profound gesture. Palace officials exchanged glances of confusion and concern, while security personnel remained frozen, unsure whether this represented a security threat or simply another bewildering departure from established norms. When Louis raised his head, his expression was calm but somehow transformed. Without saying a word, he had managed to convey something that months of carefully crafted statements had failed to communicate: genuine humility and recognition of the responsibility he carried not just to the crown, but to the people it served.
Prince William approached his brother, speaking quietly. "Are you all right?"
Louis nodded, his voice clear but soft enough that only those nearest could hear.
"I think so. For the first time in a long while, I think I'm exactly where I need to be."
The moment passed, and the royal party continued to their cars. But the image of Prince Louis bowing his head in that historic corridor was already spreading across social media and news networks worldwide. The gesture was open to multiple interpretations, but its authenticity was undeniable.
Back at the palace, the immediate reaction was predictable chaos.
Sir Anthony Morrison called emergency meetings while communications staff struggled to craft responses to media inquiries about what the gesture had meant. Some interpreted it as a sign of respect for democratic institutions, others saw it as acknowledgement of personal struggle, still others viewed it as a revolutionary moment in royal protocol.
But Louis wasn't thinking about interpretations or communication strategies.
That evening, he returned to his study and drafted a letter to his father, attempting to explain what had happened and why. "Dear Papa," he wrote, "I know today's gesture will require explanation and possibly create difficulties for the institution we both serve.
I want you to understand that it wasn't planned or calculated for effect. In that moment, surrounded by the weight of tradition and the reality of the struggles I've witnessed in recent weeks, I felt compelled to acknowledge both the honor and the burden of our position. I've spent months questioning my relevance and purpose, wondering whether the monarchy as we've known it still serves the people it's meant to protect. Today, I realized that the question isn't whether we're perfect or whether our institution is without flaws. The question is whether we're willing to serve humbly, acknowledging our limitations while striving to use whatever influence we have for genuinely meaningful purposes. The bow wasn't a rejection of royal duty, it was an acceptance of what that duty really means in the 21st century. It means being present for people's struggles, not standing above them. It means admitting when we don't have answers, not pretending to wisdom we haven't earned. It means using our privilege to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. I don't know what the reaction will be, but I know that for the first time in my adult life, I acted from authentic conviction rather than institutional obligation. If that creates problems for the monarchy, perhaps those are problems worth having. The king's response came the following morning, delivered personally rather than through official channels. He appeared at Louis's door early, still in casual clothes from his morning walk. "Your letter was illuminating," he said simply. "But I think we need to talk about what comes next." They walked together through the palace gardens, away from the staff and advisors who had been strategizing responses since the previous afternoon. The gesture yesterday, the king began, was either a moment of profound wisdom or a significant political miscalculation. The reaction suggests it might be both. Louis looked at his father with surprise. "What do you mean?" The negative response has been predictably fierce. Constitutional scholars are debating the implications, conservative commentators are questioning your fitness for royal duties, and some government officials are privately expressing concern about your reliability. Louis felt his stomach tighten. And the positive response? The king smiled, pulling out his phone to show social media feeds. Hashtags supporting you are trending globally. Letters of support are arriving by the thousands. Most surprisingly, polling shows a significant increase in public support for the monarchy, particularly among younger demographics who've historically been skeptical. They sat on a bench overlooking the roses that had been the king's passion for decades. Your great-grandmother faced similar crossroads, the king continued. Moments when she had to choose between institutional safety and authentic service. She usually chose authenticity, and history proved her right. But the institution survived her choices. Yes, but, more importantly, it grew stronger because of them. She understood that relevance requires risk, and that authenticity creates trust in ways that perfection never can. Louis felt something settling inside him, a sense of resolution he hadn't experienced in months. "What do you think I should do?" "Continue being yourself," the king replied without hesitation. "But do it thoughtfully, with full awareness of both the platform you've been given and the responsibility that comes with it." Over the following weeks, Louis developed a new approach to royal duty that balanced institutional requirements with the authenticity that had sparked such strong reactions. He continued his hospital visits, but with greater focus and deeper engagement. He expanded his work with young people, creating programs that addressed real challenges rather than offering ceremonial support. Most importantly, he began using his platform to highlight stories that might otherwise remain invisible. His social media accounts, once carefully managed promotional tools, became channels for sharing the experiences of people he met: single mothers building businesses despite systemic obstacles, veterans creating support networks for mental health, young entrepreneurs developing solutions to community problems. The reaction remained mixed. Traditional royal watchers continued to express concern about precedent and protocol. But something fundamental had shifted in public perception. Louis had demonstrated that vulnerability could coexist with dignity, that questioning could strengthen rather than weaken institutional commitment. 6 months after the state opening incident, Louis received an invitation that would have been unthinkable under the old approach to royal duty. The University of Manchester's Student Union requested his participation in a debate about the role of privilege in modern society. Not as a guest speaker offering prepared remarks, but as an actual participant willing to defend his positions and engage with challenging questions. Against the advice of palace communications staff, Louis accepted. The debate was held in the university's largest lecture hall, filled with students who had grown up questioning traditional authority structures. These weren't ceremonial audiences trained in royal protocol, they were young people who expected honest answers to difficult questions. Prince Louis, began Sarah Chen, a third-year politics student, you've spoken about using your privilege responsibly, but isn't the very existence of hereditary monarchy fundamentally unjust, regardless of how individual royals choose to behave? Louis paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. You're absolutely right to question the justice of inherited privilege, he replied. I didn't earn my position, and I can't pretend otherwise. The question isn't whether the system is perfect, it clearly isn't. The question is whether someone in my position can use whatever influence comes with it to advance causes that might not otherwise receive attention. But, wouldn't it be more honest to simply abolish the monarchy and redistribute its resources? Pressed another student. Perhaps, Louis acknowledged. But, that's a decision for the British people to make democratically. Until then, I have a choice. I can fulfill my role as a ceremonial figurehead, or I can try to use whatever platform I have to draw attention to issues that matter. I choose the latter, even though it's messier and more controversial. The debate continued for 2 hours, covering topics from wealth inequality to democratic legitimacy to the role of traditional institutions in modern society. Louis didn't win every argument, and he didn't try to. Instead, he engaged honestly with ideas that challenged his position, acknowledging complexities rather than offering simple answers. The video of the debate, streamed live online, became one of the most watched royal events in decades. Not because of ceremony or spectacle, but because it showed a member of the royal family willing to subject himself to genuine scrutiny and respond with thoughtful humility. That evening, as Louis returned to London, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The questioning that had once felt like weakness now seemed like strength. The uncertainty that had plagued him for months had transformed into clarity about his purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen at the hospital. Emma wanted you to know she's been cancer-free for 3 months. She says to tell you that brave princes are her favorite kind. Louis smiled, remembering the little girl whose simple question about fear had started this entire transformation. In learning to acknowledge his own vulnerability, he had discovered a form of strength he never knew existed. The hall had indeed fallen quiet when he bowed his head, but from that silence had emerged a new understanding of what authentic service could look like. The future remained uncertain, full of questions about tradition and change, institution and individual conviction. But, for the first time in his life, Louis was ready to face those questions honestly, knowing that the courage to be genuinely human might be the most royal quality of all.